What I'm going to do here is for all of us that don't have our muscles built up strong when it comes to reading and writing and really understanding what we read and really seeing through and being able to pick apart and deconstruct what's put in front of us. And we're going to read a story today. And it's a story that I think is relevant to what we're talking about. And it's written by Ernest Hemingway, and it's called Indian Camp. A lot of these great American writers, you know, they were on the fringes, and they were talking about controversial things at the time. And you can see in their stories, and you can see in the work that they left behind, that a few of them were trying to poke through the consensus of the times and trying to add some humanity into the way the people that felt and the way that people saw the world. And that's what's great about literature, you know? I mean, if you want to, we can read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. We could read whatever y'all want. You know, you can make suggestions. But this reading lesson in particular is nice and short, and I believe that it also has a nice little twist in there that's going to help readers that aren't strong readers become strong readers. Anyway, so we got Indian Camp. Get your book out. We're going to start from the beginning together. And there's a couple things I want you to keep watch for. When you're reading something, a big mistake that a lot of people make is they just want to get to the end, you know, and pick up as much as they can from the time they start until the time they finish. And I'm saying that that's an error. I think that it's good to, when you go and you read something, no matter what it is, if you have this capability and this intelligence to do it this way, the right way, why do it the short way? Why do it the fast way? If you fancy yourself a reader because you go on like blogs and clickbait and shit on Facebook and the internet, you're not a reader. I mean, just because you can read words and make sense of half or more of them or enough of them to put the context to a situation and understand the grand scheme of what the writer's trying to say, that doesn't mean you're a reader. That means you're an observer. You know, a reader is somebody that's able actually to participate in what they're doing. I mean, so they're taking the words, and not only do they understand the words, if they don't understand them, they make themselves understand them. So if you come onto a word, like a difficult word, you don't know what it means, you look at things like the context of that word in the sentence, right? Or you look at things like the prefix or the base word or the suffix on the word, so you can kind of have clues to what it means, you know? Like, we all know what the word antisocial means, but if we didn't, you could look at the word social, which means being amongst people, and you look at the word anti means against, and then you know that antisocial means against being social, you know? So sometimes it helps us if we know the base word, but we don't know the prefix, to try to make sense of it. And sometimes it helps us to look at that word and how it's placed in the sentence. But the worst thing you can do, which is the most common thing that everybody does, you know, is to just skip past shit that you don't know. Because that's like a lesson that you didn't learn. You know, you're missing the whole point. You know, if you go and you didn't read a word, like if you see the word acrimonious and you didn't look it up, like pull out the dictionary and figure out that shit and then try to figure out how it worked in the sentence. It's almost like if you're at the gym and you're looking at the bar and you're like, oh man, you know, this is a pole and it's got round circles and shit. Oh, maybe I'll pick it up some other day, not today. You know, you're not getting anything done. You know, so what you do is you stop and you try to figure out what the hell you're talking about or what the writer's talking about, and you try to understand it. And you don't usually move on until you get an understanding. I mean, how do we get lessons, right? You know, not two until one, not three until two, you know, one after the other. You had to do the first one before you do the second one. It's the same thing with reading a sentence. You don't want to just, fuck it, and just keep going on, because that's what's going to make you weaker than everybody that does understand, okay? Because everything that you don't understand, somebody else out there understands it perfectly. I want to be the person that understands it. So we're dealing with Indian Camp. I want you to read along with me. I'm going to make a couple notes as we go so you can pay attention to some things. But as we're reading, I want you to be able to answer two questions at the end of it. And I'm going to tell you the two questions ahead of time. And that's like a bonus, because I really shouldn't do that. That's kind of against the exercise. But I want y'all to really be paying attention. So I'm going to tell you the two questions that I'm going to have for you right ahead. The first one is, who is the real father? Who is the real father of the baby? And you'll know who the baby is, and you'll know that it has a father. So keep that question in your mind. And what I did was I just gave you some information. I just told you that the father, the presumed father of the baby, is not the real father. So that's something you would have had to figure out by yourself. Another question is, where do we know that the doctor believes Indians are animals? All right? And Indians, we're not talking about Hindi from India. We're talking about, of course, Native Americans. Where do we find out that the doctor believes Indians are animals? Okay? Because if you don't know this, I mean, the Native Americans, of course, lived in this country before the Europeans came over, and their ways were very different. And there's nothing sweet about that. It's a tale of thievery and everything. But all that ghastliness aside, the psychology behind it is even sicker, right? The doctor, white, right, believes that the Indians are animals, not humans, okay? That's serious. I mean, that's different than two groups of people conquering each other. That's a perception of a human being being less than human. And that's something that's plagued the whole world. I mean, if you look at the Australian Aborigines or anywhere you look throughout history, you're going to see this kind of attitude. And because, and a lot of times it has to do with people having culture that's looked at as less sophisticated than European culture. But if you look at European culture, as we know, there's a lot of savagery in European culture. So it's basically about different choices of how to live life and different belief systems and different cultural norms. And the ones that tend to have the cultural norms that make them less a powerful military, if you want to use that word, tend to be the ones that get conquered, regardless. The ones that tend to be viewed as less sophisticated tend to get conquered. So we're looking at the Indians, who were conquered, and we're looking at a situation with a doctor and a son. And I just want to know, where's the point? Where's the sentence where you know in your head that for a fact this doctor just thinks this lady's an animal? Okay? All right. Indian camp. Guys, get the link and pause me. At the lake shore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The two Indians stood waiting. And remember, as we're going, you paint that picture in your head. You try to visualize what's happening. You're going to pick up details by visualization. Paint the picture as you're reading. And don't be satisfied until that picture is filled out. Nick and his father got in the stern of the boat, and the Indians shoved it off, and one of them got in to row. You ever heard the word stern before? Okay, because if you're not, an aquatic motherfucker, you might not have heard stern, right? I know that I learned the word stern as an adult, It's the back of the boat. But you'd want to look it up. You'd want to figure out what the hell that meant. So if you didn't know, you'd want to look it up. Pause and say, what's a stern? You got a phone. You look it up anywhere. But you don't get lazy. You read it. You look it up. Uncle George sat in the stern of the camp rowboat. The young Indian shoved the camp boat off and got in to row Uncle George. The two boats started off in the dark. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other boat quite a way ahead of them in the mist. The Indians rowed with quick, choppy strokes. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. It was cold on the water. The Indian who was rowing them was working very hard, but the other boat moved further ahead in the mist all the time. "Where are we going, Dad?" Nick asked. "Over to the Indian camp. There's an Indian lady, very sick." "Oh," said Nick. Across the bay, they found the other boat beached. Uncle George was smoking a cigar in the dark. The young Indian pulled the boat up on the beach, way up on the beach. Uncle George gave both the Indians cigars. They walked up from the beach through a meadow that was soaking wet with dew, following the young Indian, who carried a lantern. Then they went into the woods and followed a trail that led to the logging road that ran back to the hills. It was much lighter on the logging road as the timber was cut away on both sides. The young Indian stopped and blew out his lantern, and they all walked along the road. They came around a bend, and a dog came out barking. Ahead were the lights of the shanties where the Indian bark peelers lived. More dogs rushed out at them. The two Indians sent them back to their shanties. In the shanty nearest the road, there was a light in the window. An old woman stood in the doorway holding a lamp. Now, depending on your age, you might not know what a shanty is. It's basically a home or a small building, probably something that's not very strongly built. Inside on a wooden bunk lay a young Indian woman. She had been trying to have her baby for 2 days. Shit, man. All the old women in the camp had been helping her. The men had moved off up the road to sit in the dark and smoke out of the range of the noise she made. She screamed just as Nick and the two Indians followed his father and Uncle George into the shanty. She lay in the lower bunk, very big, under a quilt. Her head was turned to one side. In the upper bunk, there was her husband. He had cut his foot very badly with an axe 3 days before. He was smoking a pipe. The room smelled very bad. Nick's father ordered some water to be put on the stove, and while he was heating it, he spoke to Nick. Okay, so let's pause for a second. What's the situation? The doctor, Nick, they both kind of arrive, right? And then Uncle George, so I'm guessing it's Nick's uncle, right, is there. What happened next? What happened? We already know about what the boat looked like. It was cold out. I picked up all those details. But what happened when they arrived ashore finally? What did Uncle George do? Okay. If you're looking at the details too of like how gross this old school pregnancy delivery situation might have been, man. I mean, like, the room smells bad. Hemingway's good in the sense that he writes things really tightly and very simply. This lady's going to have a baby, Nick, he said. I know, said Nick. You don't know, said his father. Listen to me. What she's going through is being in labor. The baby wants to be born, and she wants it to be born. All her muscles are trying to get the baby born. That's what's happening when she screams. I see, Nick said. Just then the woman cried out. Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming? Asked Nick. No, I haven't any anesthetic, his father said. But her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they're not important. The husband in the upper bunk rolled over against the wall. The woman in the kitchen motioned to the doctor that the water was hot. Nick's father went into the kitchen and poured about half of the water out of the big kettle into a basin. Into the water left in the kettle, he put several things he unwrapped from a handkerchief. Those must boil, he said, and began to scrub his hands in the basin of hot water with a cake of soap he had brought from the camp. Nick watched his father's hands scrubbing each other with the soap. While his father washed his hands very carefully and thoroughly, he talked. You see, Nick, babies are supposed to be born head first, but sometimes they're not. When they're not, they make a lot of trouble for everybody. Maybe I'll have to operate on this lady. We'll know in a little while. When he was satisfied with his hands, he went in and he went to work. Pull back that quilt, will you, George? He said. I'd rather not touch it. Later, when he started to operate, Uncle George and 3 Indian men held the woman still. She bit Uncle George on the arm, and Uncle George said, Damn squaw, bitch. What's a squaw? I'm guessing that the squaw is a racial slur for Indian, right? And he called her bitch, too. So Uncle George's not playing, Cheese up, hose down. And the young Indian who had rode Uncle George over laughed at him. Nick held the basin for his father. It all took a long time. His father picked up the baby and slapped it to make sure it could breathe and handed it to the old woman. See, it's a boy, said Nick. He said, How do you like being an intern? Nick said, All right. He was looking away so as not to see what his father was doing. There, that gets it, said his father, and put something into the basin. Nick didn't look at it. Now, his father said, there's some stitches to put in. You can watch this or not, Nick, just as you like. I'm going to sew up the incision I made. If you don't know what the word incision means, you look it up. Nick did not watch. His curiosity had been gone for a long time. His father finished and stood up. Uncle George and the 3 Indian men stood up. Nick put the basin out in the kitchen. Uncle George looked at his arm. The young Indian smiled reminiscently. I guess they were kind of clowning on Uncle George. I'll put some peroxide on that, George, the doctor said. He bent over the Indian woman. She was quiet now and her eyes were closed. She looked very pale. She did not know what had become of the baby or anything. I'll be back in the morning, the doctor said, standing up. The nurse should be here from St. Agnes by noon and she'll bring everything we need. He was feeling exalted, look it up if you don't know it, and talkative as a football players are in the dressing room after a game. That's one for the medical journal, George, he said, doing a cesarean, if you don't know what it means, look it up, with a jackknife and sewing it up with a 9-foot tapered gut leaders. Now, I don't know what 9-foot tapered gut leaders are, but just based on the fact that it had something to do with that operation, I'm using the context of that sentence to guess that it's just a tool or device or something that they were using for the operation. Uncle George was standing against the wall looking at his arm. Oh, you're a great man, all right, he said. Ought to have a look at the proud father. They're usually the worst sufferers in these little affairs, the doctor said. Where was the husband? He was only mentioned once, right? Where was he? Go back and look if you don't know. Pause me. All right. I must say he took it all pretty quietly. He pulled back the blanket from the Indian's head. His hand came away wet. He mounted on the edge of the lower bunk with the lamp in one hand and looked in. The Indian lay with his face toward the wall. His throat had been cut from ear to ear. The blood had flowed down into a pool where his body sagged to the bunk. His head rested on his left arm. The open razor lay edge up in the blankets. So he'd committed suicide. Take Nick out of the shanty, George, the doctor said. There was no need of that. Nick, standing in the door of the kitchen, had a good view of the upper bunk when his father, the lamp in one hand, tipped the Indian's head back. So the kid had to see that. It was just the beginning of daylight when they walked along the logging road back towards the lake. I'm terribly sorry I brought you along, Nicky, his father said, with all operative exhilaration gone. If you don't know what exhilaration means, you look it up. It was an awful mess to put you through. Do ladies always have such a hard time giving babies, Nick asked. No, that was very exceptional. Why did he kill himself, Daddy? I don't know, Nick. He couldn't stand things, I guess. Do many men kill themselves, Daddy? Not very many, Nick. Do many women? Hardly ever. Don't they ever? Oh, yes, they do sometimes. Daddy? Yes? Where did Uncle George go? He'll turn up all right. Is dying hard, Daddy? No, I think it's pretty easy, Nick. It all depends. They were seated in the boat, Nick in the stern, his father rowing. The sun was coming up over the hills. A bass jumped, making a circle in the water. Nick trailed his hand in the water. It felt warm in the sharp chill of the morning. In the early morning on the lake, sitting in the stern of the boat with his father rowing, he felt quite sure that he would never die. The end. So when we read a story like Indian Camp, I mean, I think the most basic reader that can just basically read 5th, 6th, 7th grade language is able to make out most of those words. It's probably about 5 to 10 words in there that are above a 5th or 6th grade level. The sentences are uncomplicated. There's not a whole lot of technical terminology that you would need to know. So that's an idea of an adult story that's basically readable by children. Okay? So whether you're 13, 15, 18, or 22 and you're trying to pass a test, that's the skill level. That's the set that you're going to experience on all these tests. When it comes to standardized tests, they're going to be doing it between, 5th and 10th grade level stuff. They're not going to give you the hardest of the hard, and they're not going to give you the easiest of the easiest. It's a nice medium story. Any basic reader understood some basic things about that story. They understand that there was a father and there was a son. They understood that there was a trip on water, which led to a camp or an island where Indians lived. They understood that there was an Indian woman who was pregnant trying to have a baby. They understood that the father didn't seem super sympathetic when she was in pain. They understood that the father was trying to teach the son and that he was disappointed that he had allowed the son to see as much as he did. They understand that the husband of the woman, the father of the baby, killed himself. And they understand that at the end, the boy, Nick, and his father were heading home. And Nick, in his head, was kind of affected by what he saw and contemplating mortality on the way home. So those are the baseline things. But a good reader found some other things there. A good reader, by knowledge of basic American and a lot of other country customs, that the father wasn't actually the husband. And there's a reason why the husband committed suicide. There's a couple of things in this story that are there, but you got to find them, all right? So who was the father of this baby? And how do you know that, all right? How do you know for a fact that that's got to be the dad, okay? Question 1. Question 2. Why do you know for a fact that the doctor looked at the woman as an animal and not as a human being, the Indian woman that was giving birth? And the third extra surprise question that I'm going to give you guys is that why? Why did the husband, or a supposed father, why did he kill himself? What sound or sight made that take place? Guys, I'm going to do a follow-up video where we can talk about people's answers. But I know the answers to all these questions, and I know that if they're not immediately obvious to you, because they were immediately obvious to me, if they're not immediately obvious to you, then that means you got some work you got to do on your reading comprehension, especially before you want to work on a college level in terms of academics, especially before, especially if you're going to be dealing with one of the subjects that requires a lot of reading and writing. But that's the difference between a strong reader and a weak reader. A weak reader will get the outline, but a strong reader is going to get all the details and see all the images and be able to think along with the reading. Okay, so instead of you just reading a book, it's not like a movie. You can't expect the experience of it to happen to you, to wash over you. This is something where you're involved and you got to bring your intelligence to the table. You don't just put enough confidence in the writer knowing that the writer's trying to tell you something and send you a message. You've got to put enough confidence in the writer to know the writer was good enough to basically ask you questions along the way and have you answer them. All right. So please, below, if you're interested in finding out how to be a stronger reader, we're going to start with that, and then we can move on to math. I've got my first 5 lesson videos up of how to pass standardized tests. They've all been very helpful for others. You can look at those. They're on my lesson section of my video channel. So hopefully this was enlightening for some of you guys, or at least moderately helpful for some of you guys, especially those of you that are students. Hopefully you forgive my rant in the beginning, and also my coupling of this rant alongside with the reading lesson. But like I said, man, my time's been short these days, and I'd rather be here for you than not be here at all. All right, y'all. Peace.